There is a question that most people never bother to ask, because everyday life does not force it on them. The question is this: how do you live a meaningful, responsible life if the universe was not made for you? Not merely indifferent to your happiness, but indifferent to your existence altogether. Most philosophical traditions dodge this question by denying its premise. They insert a God, a cosmic plan, a hidden purpose that guarantees human significance in advance. Carl Sagan refused every one of those guarantees. He was an astronomer, a planetary scientist, and a public thinker who died in 1996. But calling him a science communicator misses the scope of what he built. Across his major works, Sagan constructed a complete philosophical system. It has an epistemology, a theory of how we can know what is true. It has a psychology, an account of why we so often prefer what is false. It has an ethics, a framework for what we owe each other and why. And it has a politics, a theory of what institutions are needed to protect all of the above. None of these pieces stands alone. Each one answers a specific problem that the previous piece left unresolved, and taken together they form one of the most coherent naturalistic philosophies of the 20th century. What makes Sagan unusual is not that he rejected the supernatural. Plenty of thinkers have done that. What makes him unusual is that he took the emotional consequences of that rejection seriously. He understood that if you strip away comforting illusions, you have to replace them with something real. Not just arguments, but genuine sources of meaning, wonder, and moral urgency. Whether he succeeded is a question worth taking seriously. To answer it, we need to rebuild his philosophy from the ground up. We start where he started, with the most basic question of all. How do you know when something is true? Part 1. The problem of reliable knowing. You are walking through a forest at dusk. A branch snaps somewhere to your left. Before you have time to think, your body tenses, your eyes lock on the direction of the sound. Your brain has already generated a hypothesis. Something is out there. This is not a flaw in your cognition. This is the machinery that kept your ancestors alive for hundreds of thousands of years. The brain is a pattern detection engine built by natural selection to find structure in noise. It connects scattered data points into coherent stories at extraordinary speed. A rustle becomes a predator. A streak of light becomes a signal. A coincidence becomes a cause. The common-sense view of knowledge runs something like this. You observe the world carefully, you think about what you observe, and you arrive at the truth. This seems entirely reasonable. It respects the evidence of your senses and the power of your reasoning. Most people operate on this assumption every day without questioning it. And for navigating traffic or choosing ripe fruit, it works well enough. Sagan identifies the precise point where this breaks down. The same machinery that detects real patterns also generates false ones. Your brain does not wait for sufficient evidence before constructing a story. It constructs the story first and then looks for confirmation. A doctor glances at a patient's chart and forms an impression in seconds. From that moment, she is more likely to notice symptoms that fit her initial read. A jury member hears the opening statement and begins leaning toward a verdict. The rest of the trial becomes a sorting exercise, keeping what fits, discarding what does not. This is not laziness or stupidity. This is how human cognition is wired at its most basic level. The problem is not that we sometimes make mistakes. The problem is that we make mistakes systematically and in predictable directions. We see patterns in random data. We confuse correlation with causation. We give more weight to vivid stories than to statistical evidence. We remember the hits and forget the misses. A person who believes in astrology recalls the week her horoscope was accurate. She does not keep a ledger of the weeks it was completely wrong. A gambler remembers the night he won big at the table. The accumulated losses blur into background noise. Sagan's conclusion is not that human beings are hopeless. His conclusion is that individual human cognition, left to its own devices, is unreliable. Careful observation plus common sense is not enough, because the observer is compromised. Your eyes are fine, but the software interpreting the signal is riddled with shortcuts. This is the foundational problem from which everything else in his philosophy follows. If you cannot trust your own unassisted mind to sort truth from falsehood, what can you trust? His answer is a method, not a set of facts, not a collection of truths carved into stone, but a procedure. Science, for Sagan, is not the body of knowledge found in textbooks. It is an institutionalized system for catching your own errors before they harden into certainties. The critical word is institutionalized. A single honest person can try to check her own biases, but she will often fail. What science does is build error correction into the social structure of inquiry itself. Your results must be published so others can attempt to reproduce them. Your methods must be transparent so others can find flaws you missed. Your most cherished hypothesis must be framed so that it can, in principle, be proven wrong. And the highest honours go not to those who confirm what everyone already believes. They go to those who demonstrate that a previously accepted idea was mistaken. This last point is the one most people miss about science. In most human institutions, challenging the authority of established figures is punished. In religion, it is heresy. In politics, it is disloyalty. In corporate hierarchies, it is insubordination. In science, at least in principle, it is the highest form of contribution. The young researcher who proves that a Nobel laureate was wrong gets celebrated, not exiled. The system is specifically designed to reward the act of overturning established conclusions. This means that doubt, for Sagan, is not the enemy of knowledge. Doubt is the engine that drives knowledge forward. A claim that has survived rigorous attempts to destroy it is far more trustworthy than one that has never been tested. And a claim that cannot even in principle be tested is not knowledge at all. It is something else entirely, and we will return to what that something else is. But first, there is a harder question lurking beneath this one. If the scientific method is such a powerful tool for error correction, why do most people resist using it? Why is pseudoscience not just common, but deeply, persistently satisfying? Part 2. The Baloney Detection Kit as Epistemology. Before we can ask why people reject good thinking, we need to be precise about what good thinking looks like. Sagan does not leave this vague. In his book, The Demon-Haunted World, he lays out a specific toolkit, which he calls the Baloney Detection Kit. The name is deliberately informal, but the contents are rigorous. Each tool targets a specific failure mode of the human mind. Together they form a coherent theory of what counts as evidence and what does not. The first tool is independent confirmation. If someone tells you a fact, check whether a separate, unrelated source confirms it. This seems obvious, but consider how rarely people actually do it. A friend shares a news headline that confirms what you already suspect about a politician. You feel a small rush of satisfaction and pass it along without checking. The story may be accurate, distorted, or fabricated, but it felt true, so you treated it as true. Independent confirmation is designed to interrupt that reflex. It forces a pause between the feeling of truth and the acceptance of truth. The second tool is adversarial debate among people who actually know the subject. Not argument for its own sake, but structured disagreement aimed at finding weaknesses. Sagan is specific that the debaters must be knowledgeable. A shouting match between two uninformed people produces heat, not light. What matters is that every claim gets tested by someone who has the expertise to test it properly. This is the principle behind peer review in scientific publishing. Before your paper reaches the public, it must survive scrutiny from people who want to find its flaws. The third tool is deep suspicion of arguments from authority. Sagan does not say that experts are always wrong. He says that the fact someone is an authority does not by itself make their claim true. Authorities have been wrong before and will be wrong again. In science, there are no authorities in the strong sense. There are only experts whose claims still need to be tested against evidence. A physician in the 1850s who told his colleagues to wash their hands before surgery was ignored. The authorities of his era believed that gentlemen's hands could not carry disease. The evidence said otherwise, and the evidence was right. The fourth tool is generating multiple hypotheses. When you encounter something that needs explaining, do not grab the first idea that fits and stop there. Think of every plausible explanation, then systematically look for evidence that would eliminate each one. The hypothesis that survives the most attempts to kill it earns your tentative trust. A detective who fixates on the first suspect and ignores all other leads is a bad detective. The same principle applies to every domain where truth matters. The fifth tool is refusing to fall in love with your own hypothesis. This sounds like mere advice about humility, but Sagan means something more structural. Once you have invested time and identity in an idea, your brain begins to protect it. Counter-evidence starts to feel like a personal attack rather than useful information. Sagan treats this as a predictable cognitive hazard, not a character flaw. The solution is to deliberately seek out evidence that could prove you wrong before anyone else does. The sixth tool is quantification. Wherever possible, attach numbers to claims, because numbers allow precise comparison. This treatment works is vague enough to be meaningless. This treatment reduces symptoms by 30% in controlled trials, can be tested and compared. Without numbers, arguments become contests of rhetoric rather than evidence. The seventh tool requires that every link in a chain of reasoning must hold. A conclusion that depends on 5 steps is only as strong as its weakest step. If step 3 fails, the conclusion fails, no matter how solid steps 1, 2, 4, and 5 are. This seems elementary, yet people routinely accept conclusions built on broken chains. A political argument might begin with a true premise and end with a true conclusion, but contain a gap in the middle. The feeling of overall coherence disguises the missing connection. The 8th tool is the principle known as Occam's razor. When 2 explanations account for the same evidence equally well, prefer the simpler one. This is not because the universe is obligated to be simple. It is because unnecessary complexity creates additional claims that need supporting evidence of their own. Every extra assumption is a potential point of failure. The explanation that requires fewer unsupported assumptions is less likely to be wrong. The 9th and final tool is falsifiability. Every meaningful claim must be capable, at least in principle, of being shown to be false. Sagan illustrates this with a thought experiment that has become one of his most famous arguments. He asks you to suppose that he claims a fire-breathing dragon lives in his garage. You come to look and see nothing. He explains the dragon is invisible. You suggest spreading flour on the floor to capture footprints. He replies, the dragon floats. You propose an infrared sensor to detect the fire. He says the fire is heatless. You suggest spray paint to reveal the outline of the body. He tells you the dragon has no physical form. Every test you propose he defeats with a special exemption. And here Sagan asks the question that drives the entire thought experiment to its conclusion. What is the difference between an invisible, weightless, heatless, untouchable dragon and no dragon at all? If no conceivable evidence could count against the claim, then the claim has no contact with reality. It is not that the claim has been proven false. It is that the claim has been constructed so that it cannot be proven false. And a claim that cannot be tested, Sagan argues, is worthless as a statement about what is real. Whatever emotional comfort it provides, it gives you zero information about the actual world. These 9 tools are not a casual list of tips for clear thinking. Taken together, they constitute a full epistemological position. They define what counts as a legitimate claim to knowledge and what does not. They specify what kind of evidence is required and what kind of reasoning is valid. And they place the burden of proof squarely on the person making the claim, not on the person questioning it. This is the infrastructure of Sagan's entire philosophical project. Every argument he will make about wonder, ethics, politics, and human survival depends on these tools being reliable. But here is the problem. These tools cannot solve on their own. Pseudoscience is not just a collection of isolated bad claims that could be picked off one by one. It is a system, and it meets deep psychological needs that the Baloney detection kit does not address. People do not believe in astrology because they have never heard of falsifiability. They believe because astrology gives them something that correct thinking, on its own, does not. The question Sagan must answer next is the hardest one his epistemology faces. What exactly are those needs, and why is bad knowledge so much better at meeting them? Part 3. Why false answers feel true. The easy move, the one most defenders of science make, is to treat believers in pseudoscience as fools. They did not pay attention in school, they lack critical thinking skills, they are gullible. Sagan refuses this move. He considers it not just unkind, but intellectually lazy, because it fails to explain the actual phenomenon. If bad beliefs were simply the product of ignorance, then education alone would eliminate them. But education does not eliminate them. Highly educated people believe in astrology, consult psychics, and embrace conspiracy theories. Something deeper is operating, and Sagan wants to know what it is. His analysis begins with a specific observation about what pseudoscience actually offers. It speaks directly to emotional needs that real science often leaves unanswered. Consider astrology. A woman opens her horoscope on a difficult morning. She has just been passed over for a promotion, and her relationship is fraying at the edges. The horoscope tells her that Mercury is in retrograde and that challenging transitions are temporary. It tells her that her sign is entering a period of renewal and that patience will be rewarded. What has this given her? 3 things, each of them psychologically powerful. First, an explanation for her suffering that does not require her to blame herself or accept randomness. The planets cause this, not her inadequacy, not meaningless chance. There is a reason. Things are hard right now, and that reason is built into the structure of the cosmos. Second, a prediction that things will improve, which provides hope even when her situation offers none. Third, and most subtly, a sense that the universe is paying attention to her specifically. Among billions of people on a spinning rock in empty space, the stars have arranged themselves in a pattern that is about her. She matters cosmically. Now set that against what rigorous science offers the same woman on the same morning. Science tells her that the planets do not influence human affairs. Her suffering has no cosmic explanation and may have no satisfying explanation at all. Some professional setbacks result from identifiable causes, and some result from systemic randomness that has nothing to do with her merit. The universe is not paying attention to her because the universe does not pay attention to anything. It is not hostile, but it is not watching. This is accurate. It is also, emotionally, a desert. Sagan sees this clearly, and this is what separates him from most scientific rationalists of his era. He does not pretend that the truth is automatically comforting. He identifies 3 specific human drives that pseudoscience exploits and that honest science, at least in its raw form, struggles to satisfy. The first is the need for agency. When bad things happen, people desperately want to believe that something somewhere is in control. A parent whose child is diagnosed with a serious illness does not want to hear that the cause is a random genetic mutation. She wants to hear that there is a reason, because a reason implies that something can be done. Pseudoscience offers agency in a world that often provides none. Crystals channel energy that you can direct. Rituals influence outcomes that you can perform. The illusion of control is psychologically preferable to the reality of helplessness. The second is the hunger for simple causal stories. The actual mechanisms behind most events are tangled, probabilistic, and unsatisfying. Why did one person get cancer and another did not? The honest answer involves dozens of interacting genetic and environmental factors, many of them not yet fully understood. The pseudoscientific answer involves a single clear cause: toxins, energy blockages, spiritual imbalance. One answer maps the world as a vast web of unresolved complexity. The other draws a clean line from cause to effect. The human brain finds the clean line almost irresistibly appealing. The third is the desire for personal significance in a vast universe. This may be the deepest of the three drives. Every religious and pseudoscientific system places human beings at the center of a meaningful story. You were put here for a reason. Your life has a purpose written into the fabric of reality itself. Science, by contrast, reveals a universe that is staggeringly large and almost entirely empty of anything that cares whether you exist. The Milky Way contains roughly 200 billion stars. Your Sun is one of them, unremarkable, on an outer arm of an ordinary spiral galaxy. Your galaxy is one of roughly 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. Against that backdrop, the claim that the cosmos was arranged for your benefit requires extraordinary evidence that has never been produced. Sagan's insight here is that the appeal of irrationality is not a puzzle to be dismissed. It is a problem that demands explanation with the same rigor you would apply to any natural phenomenon. People who believe false things are not broken machines. They are functioning machines whose operating parameters are poorly matched to the task of finding truth. The pattern detection engine that kept your ancestors alive in the forest is now detecting patterns in star charts and conspiracy websites. The agency drive that motivated tool use and problem-solving now motivates belief in healing crystals and prayer circles. The significance drive that bonded communities around shared purpose now bonds them around shared delusion. This diagnosis carries a consequence that Sagan does not shy away from. If pseudoscience meets real emotional needs, then simply debunking it is not enough. Telling someone their beliefs are false without offering anything in return is not liberation. It is deprivation. You have taken away the source of their comfort and given them nothing to stand on. This forces Sagan into the hardest question his philosophy has to answer. Can reason-based thinking, honest inquiry into a universe that was not built for us, actually satisfy the human need for wonder, meaning, and significance? Or does the truth, once fully faced, leave people colder and emptier than the fictions it replaces? Part 4. The Demon-Haunted World. Before Sagan answers whether science can replace what superstition provides, he pauses to show what is at stake if it cannot. The cost of widespread irrationality is not merely personal confusion. It is political catastrophe. To make this case, he reaches back across centuries of human history. Every civilization, Sagan observes, has had its demons. Not metaphorical demons, but literal ones. Entities believed to inhabit the world alongside human beings, invisible, powerful, and malicious. In medieval Europe, they were devils and witches. In other cultures, they were spirits, curses, or vengeful ancestors. The specific mythology varies, but the underlying structure is always the same. There are hidden forces causing your suffering, and only certain authorities can protect you from them. Sagan draws a direct line from this structure to political control. When people believe in invisible threats they cannot verify for themselves, they become dependent on whoever claims the power to manage those threats. A priest who can identify witches holds enormous power over a village. Not because he is strong or wealthy, but because he controls the explanation for why the crops failed and the children got sick. A government that names its political opponents as agents of demonic forces can justify any level of repression. The accused cannot prove their innocence because the accusation is unfalsifiable by design. The European witch trials are Sagan's most detailed case study. Across roughly 3 centuries, tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly women, were tortured and killed on charges of witchcraft. The accusations followed a consistent pattern. A misfortune would occur, a dead cow, a sick child, a failed harvest. A vulnerable person in the community would be identified as the hidden cause. Under torture, she would confess, because torture reliably produces confessions regardless of truth. She would then name others, because torture reliably produces names regardless of knowledge. The cycle would continue until someone in authority decided it had run its course. What interests Sagan is not the cruelty itself, but the epistemological structure that made the cruelty possible. The entire system rested on claims that could not be tested. How do you prove you are not a witch? You cannot, because witchcraft is defined as a hidden, invisible power whose presence is known only through its alleged effects. This is the dragon in the garage operating at civilizational scale. An unfalsifiable accusation backed by institutional authority, enforced through violence. Sagan argues that this pattern is not a relic of the distant past. It is a permanent feature of human societies that reactivates whenever the tools of critical thinking are weakened. The specific demons change their names. In the 20th century, they were called saboteurs, counter-revolutionaries, enemies of the state, or subversives. The structure remains identical. An invisible threat is named by those in power. The accused cannot disprove the charge because the charge is designed to be unfalsifiable. Fear does the rest. The title of his book, The Demon-Haunted World, is not a metaphor for general ignorance. It is a precise description of what happens when a society loses its capacity to demand evidence for claims. The demons return, wearing whatever costume the current era finds plausible. They might be witches, communists, immigrants, or shadowy conspiracies. The mechanism is always the same. An unfalsifiable threat is used to concentrate power and silence dissent. This is why Sagan treats the retreat from reason as never politically innocent. When a population cannot distinguish tested knowledge from confident assertion, it is vulnerable to anyone with a loud enough voice and a scary enough story. The defunding of science education is not a budget decision. It is, in Sagan's framework, a transfer of power from citizens who can think for themselves to authorities who prefer that they do not. But diagnosing the disease is not the same as providing the cure. Sagan has now established two things. First, that human cognition is systematically unreliable and requires institutional correction. Second, that the emotional needs driving people toward irrationality are real and will not disappear when you explain to people that their beliefs are wrong. The question he must now confront is the constructive one. Can the scientific way of seeing the world actually provide what superstition provided? Or meaning, a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself? Or is honest inquiry in the end a tool for navigating the world that leaves the deeper human hungers permanently unfed? Part 5. Wonder without illusion. The standard accusation against scientific thinking runs something like this. Science strips the world of its magic. It takes the sunset and reduces it to wavelengths of light scattered through atmospheric particles. It takes the human experience of love and reduces it to neurochemistry. It takes the night sky and turns it into a catalogue of thermonuclear reactions occurring at various distances. By explaining everything, it drains the wonder out of everything. This is a charge that has been levelled at science since at least the Romantic era, and it sounds reasonable because it matches a common human experience. When a magic trick is explained, the sense of astonishment does tend to evaporate. Understanding seems to be the enemy of awe. Sagan does not dismiss this objection. He meets it head-on, and his response is the most philosophically ambitious move in his entire body of work. He argues that the accusation rests on a mistaken theory of what wonder actually is. The common view assumes that wonder is a product of ignorance. You feel awe because you do not understand. On this view, the less you know, the more wonder is available to you, and every act of explanation is a small act of destruction. Sagan proposes the opposite. Wonder, real wonder, is not the feeling of confronting something you cannot explain. It is the feeling of confronting something whose complexity and scale exceed your capacity to fully grasp, even as you understand parts of it. The distinction is critical. Ignorance-based wonder runs out the moment you learn the answer. Complexity-based wonder deepens the more you learn, because every answer reveals further layers of structure you had not suspected. Consider the sunset that science supposedly ruins. Before you know any physics, a sunset is a wash of colour across the sky. After you learn that white light contains every visible wavelength, that the atmosphere scatters shorter wavelengths more than longer ones, and that the low angle of the evening sun forces light through more atmosphere, you see something different. You see the same colours, but now you also see the entire atmosphere operating as a vast optical instrument. You understand that the sky is blue for the same physical reason that the sunset is red. That connection between the daytime sky and the evening sky was invisible to you before. It did not exist in your experience until understanding created it. The explanation did not shrink the sunset. It revealed a larger structure that contains the sunset as one visible consequence. Sagan extends this argument to the largest scales he can reach. Consider a single human cell. Inside it are roughly 20,000 genes, each a sequence of molecular instructions written in a 4-letter chemical alphabet. Those instructions were shaped by roughly 4 billion years of unbroken evolutionary history. Every cell in your body carries a molecular record of ancestral encounters with ancient diseases, ice ages, and mass extinctions. You are, in a precise biochemical sense, a living document of your planet's entire biological past. This is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a literal description of what genomic science has revealed. Now extend further. The carbon atoms in your DNA were forged inside the cores of stars that exhausted their hydrogen fuel and collapsed billions of years ago. When those stars exploded, they scattered heavy elements across interstellar space. Some of that material eventually coalesced into the solar system, the Earth, and ultimately into you. You are, in the most physical and non-metaphorical sense, material from dead stars that has organized itself into a form that can contemplate its own origins. Sagan compressed this into one of his most precise statements. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. This is not a slogan. It is a specific philosophical claim about the relationship between consciousness and the physical universe. If you take seriously that human beings are made of ordinary matter, organized by ordinary physical processes, then the fact that this matter can think, observe and reflect is not separate from the universe. It is an activity of the universe. When a researcher aims a telescope at a distant galaxy, the universe is examining itself through one of its own locally organized components. There is no separation between the observer and the cosmos being observed. The observer is cosmos, arranged in a particular temporary configuration. Sagan uses this framework to construct what amounts to a naturalistic account of the sacred. He argues that the traditional religious sense of awe, the feeling of being in the presence of something overwhelmingly vast and meaningful, does not require a supernatural source. The actual universe, as revealed by patient scientific investigation, is more intricate, more ancient, and more strange than any mythology ever invented. A galaxy is more structurally complex than a god. The emergence of life from chemistry is more improbable than any miracle story. The fact that matter can become aware of itself is more mysterious than any soul doctrine. He positions this view against two opponents simultaneously. Against religious traditionalists, he argues that the universe does not need a designer to be worthy of reverence. Against cold reductionists, those who treat the universe as mere mechanism, he argues that reduction to physical components does not eliminate meaning. Knowing that a symphony is vibrations in air does not make the symphony less real or less moving. Knowing that love involves neurochemistry does not make love less significant to the person experiencing it. The reduction tells you what something is made of. It does not tell you what it means to the system that is experiencing it, and that experience is also part of the physical world. This is a strong position, and it has moved many people who encountered it through his television series Cosmos or his books. But there is a limitation that Sagan himself does not fully resolve. Wonder is an emotional state. It can fill you with awe, but it does not by itself tell you where you are. It does not construct a picture of your actual place in the universe or tell you what follows from that place. For that you need something more than feeling. You need to look directly at what the universe reveals about your position within it, without flinching. And what it reveals, as Sagan knew better than almost anyone, is a scale so vast that it threatens to make you disappear. Part 6. The Cosmic Address. Every culture that has ever existed has placed itself somewhere near the centre of things. The ancient Greeks put the earth at the centre of the cosmos, with celestial spheres rotating around it. Medieval Christians placed humanity at the centre of God's attention, with the entire universe created as a stage for the drama of salvation. Even secular modern societies tend to assume that human experience is the reference point for everything that matters. This assumption is so deeply embedded that most people do not even recognize it as an assumption. It feels less like a belief and more like an obvious feature of reality. Sagan sets out to dismantle this assumption systematically, one layer at a time. His method is deceptively simple. He asks you to expand your frame of reference, step by step, and watch what happens to your sense of centrality at each new scale. Start with your body. You stand roughly between 5 and 6 feet tall. Give or take. The world at this scale is the one you navigate every day. Rooms, streets, faces, trees. Everything here is built to your proportions and your perceptual range. At this scale, you are the natural reference point, and everything around you exists in relation to you. This is the scale where anthropocentrism feels completely justified. Now zoom out to the Earth. The planet is roughly 8,000 miles in diameter. At this scale, you are invisible. Entire cities are specks. The mountain range that dominates your horizon is a faint wrinkle on the surface of a sphere. Already, the world you experience every day has become a negligible texture on a much larger object. Now zoom out to the solar system. The Earth orbits the Sun at a distance of roughly 93 million miles. At this scale, the Earth is a small rocky ball circling an average star. It is the third of 8 planets, not the largest, not the smallest, not particularly remarkable in any obvious way. The entire distance from the Earth to the Moon, a journey that seemed to define the outer limit of human ambition when Apollo astronauts made it, is less than 2% of the distance to the nearest planet. The solar system is mostly empty space with a few objects drifting through it. Now zoom out to the galaxy. The Sun is one of roughly 200 billion stars in the Milky Way. It sits about 2/3 of the way out from the centre on a minor arm of the spiral, not near anything particularly notable, not in a dense cluster, not in a special position. If the Milky Way were the size of a dinner plate, the entire solar system would be smaller than a grain of sand, and you would be incomprehensibly smaller than that. Now zoom out further. The Milky Way is one of roughly 50 galaxies in its local group. That local group is one cluster among thousands in a supercluster. That supercluster is one structure among many in the observable universe, which contains roughly 2 trillion galaxies. At this scale, the question, "Where is Earth?" is almost meaningless. It is like asking for the location of a single specific atom in a building. The answer is technically expressible, but it conveys nothing about significance or centrality. This is what Sagan means by establishing your cosmic address. You live on a small rocky planet orbiting an ordinary star in the outer arm of an ordinary galaxy in an unremarkable corner of a universe so large that light from its most distant visible edges has been travelling for over 13 billion years and still has not reached most of what exists. At no level of this address are you anywhere special. There is no centre, and even if there were, you would not be at it. Sagan calls the long historical process of discovering this the Great Demotions. Copernicus showed the Earth is not the centre of the solar system. Telescopes revealed the Sun is not the centre of the galaxy. 20th century astronomy showed the galaxy is not the centre of anything. Each discovery removed one more layer of assumed human centrality. Each one was resisted, sometimes with violence, because each one threatened the narrative that the universe was arranged for human benefit. The force of this argument is cumulative. Any single demotion can be absorbed without too much discomfort. Perhaps the Earth is not the physical centre, but it could still be spiritually central. Perhaps the Sun is ordinary, but human beings could still be the point of the whole arrangement. Sagan stacks the demotions until the weight becomes difficult to bear. At the end, the question is not whether we are at the centre. The question is whether centre is even a concept that applies to a universe this vast and this indifferent to categories like centre and periphery. But spatial scale is only half the argument. Sagan knows that a person can absorb being small in space and still feel central in time. Perhaps we are tiny, but perhaps we are the point of the whole cosmic story. Perhaps everything that came before was building toward us. To address that consolation, Sagan needs a different tool. He needs to show you not just how small you are in space, but how late you are in time. Part 7. The Cosmic Calendar. The age of the universe, as best measured, is roughly 13.8 billion years. That number is easy to say, and almost impossible to feel. Human experience gives you no tools for grasping a duration that large. Your longest personal memory might stretch back 50 or 60 years. Recorded human history covers roughly 5,000 years. Even the entire span of the human species, from the first anatomically modern humans to now, is only about 300,000 years. Against 13.8 billion, 300,000 is a rounding error. The mind has no way to hold both numbers simultaneously. Sagan's solution is a compression device of extraordinary philosophical force. He takes the entire history of the universe and maps it onto a single calendar year. January 1st at midnight is the moment of the Big Bang. December 31st at midnight is right now. Every month represents a little over 1 billion years. Every day represents roughly 38 million years. Every second represents roughly 430 years. On this scale, the results are staggering. The Milky Way forms sometime around March. The solar system does not appear until early September. The first simple life on Earth emerges later that same month. For most of the calendar, nothing on Earth is more complex than single-celled organisms. Complex multicellular life does not appear until mid-December. Dinosaurs arrive around December 25th and are wiped out by December 30th. The entire age of dinosaurs, which lasted roughly 170 million years, fits into about 5 days on the cosmic calendar. The first humans appear on the evening of December 31st, around 10:30 at night to be approximate. The domestication of fire, the invention that arguably separates human existence from that of other animals, happens at roughly 11:46 on that last night. The agricultural revolution, which gave rise to cities, states and civilization as we know it, begins about 14 seconds before midnight. The entirety of recorded human history, every empire, every war, every holy book, every scientific discovery, every person you have ever heard of, occupies the last 10 seconds of the cosmic year. All of it. This is not just a clever teaching aid. It is a philosophical argument about temporal humility, and it works by creating a visceral mismatch between felt importance and actual proportion. When you learn that your entire civilization fits into the final seconds of a year-long story, the narrative that the universe was building toward you becomes very hard to maintain. For roughly 364 days and 23 hours, the universe got along without any human being at all. Stars formed, galaxies collided, planets cooled, continents drifted, and entire ecosystems rose and fell. None of it required you. None of it noticed your absence. Sagan is deliberately pushing toward an uncomfortable conclusion. If we are this small in space, as the previous part established, and this late in time, then the story of the universe is not a story about us. We are not the protagonists. We are not even a subplot. We are a very recent, very local phenomenon that emerged from physical processes that would have continued perfectly well without ever producing us. The universe did not need to become aware of itself through human consciousness. That it did so is a contingent fact, not a cosmic necessity. This is the point where Sagan's argument becomes genuinely dangerous to comforting beliefs. He has now removed both spatial and temporal centrality from the human story. You are not at the center of the universe in any physical sense. You are not the point of the universe in any temporal sense. The combined weight of these two dimensions creates a pressure that pushes hard in the direction of a single conclusion. Nothing matters. If we are this small and this brief, what could possibly give our existence significance? This is the nihilism problem, and Sagan knows it is coming. He has spent his career pushing people toward an honest picture of the cosmos. Now he must show that an honest picture does not collapse into meaninglessness. His answer will come from a photograph taken 4 billion miles from Earth. Part 8. The Pale Blue Dot as Philosophical Argument. On February 14, 1990, the Voyager 1 spacecraft was about 4 billion miles from Earth, heading out of the solar system. Sagan had spent years lobbying for one final instruction to be sent to the aging probe. He wanted Voyager to turn its camera back toward home and take a photograph. The scientific value of such a picture was essentially zero. Earth would be too small to show any detail. NASA resisted for years, partly because pointing the camera toward the inner solar system risked damage from the Sun. But once Voyager had completed its last planetary encounter with Neptune, there was nothing left to protect. The command was sent. What came back was an image of Earth as a single pixel. A pale blue point of light, barely distinguishable from the background, caught by chance in a scattered beam of sunlight reflecting off the spacecraft. There was no detail, no continents, no oceans, no clouds, just a dot. Most people encounter this image as an inspirational moment. They see it on a poster, hear a recording of Sagan reflecting on it, and feel a wash of poignant humility. That reaction is understandable, but it misses what Sagan is actually doing with the photograph. He is using it as the foundation for a philosophical argument. Not an emotional appeal, but a logical structure with premises and a conclusion. The argument runs like this. Premise 1. Everything that human beings have ever known, loved, built, destroyed, fought over, or cared about has occurred on this single, vanishingly small object. Every war was fought for a fraction of that dot. Every empire that rose and fell controlled a portion of its surface so tiny that it would not register even at the resolution of this photograph. Every genocide was committed by inhabitants of this dot against other inhabitants of this same dot. Every religion claimed to speak for the creator of a universe in which this dot is a pixel. Premise 2. There is no evidence from any source, scientific, religious or otherwise, that help will come from somewhere else. No signal has been detected from any other intelligence. No divine intervention has been observed to prevent human catastrophe at any point in recorded history. Whatever problems we face them alone on this dot. Premise 3. This dot is, as far as we currently know, the only location in the universe where conscious life exists. It may not be the only such location in principle, but it is the only one we have confirmed, and it is the only one currently available to us. Sagan's conclusion follows from these three premises taken together. If this is the only home we have, and no one is coming to save us, and everything we value exists here, and nowhere else we can reach, then our responsibility to each other is not optional. It is not a nice sentiment or a moral preference. It is a logical consequence of our actual situation. There is nowhere else to go. There is no one else to appeal to. The inhabitants of this dot are the only ones who can protect what exists on it. Every act of cruelty toward another human being is an act of destruction against the only known repository of consciousness in the cosmos. This is Sagan's ethics, and it is derived entirely from cosmology, not from commandment. He does not say you should be kind because a god demands it. He does not say you should be just because justice is built into the fabric of reality. He says you should care for each other because the alternative is the destruction of the only thing in the known universe that is capable of caring about anything. The moral weight comes not from above, but from the situation itself. Once you see where you actually are, the ethical demand is already there, waiting to be recognized. There is a subtlety here that is easy to miss. Sagan is not arguing that insignificance leads to nihilism. He is arguing the opposite, that recognizing your cosmic insignificance relocates meaning rather than destroying it. If there is no external source of purpose, no plan written into the structure of the cosmos, then the only meaning that exists is the meaning that conscious beings create and maintain. That makes us not less important, but more important, because we are the sole custodians of every value we have ever articulated. Meaning is not handed to us from outside. It is something we are responsible for, and if we destroy ourselves, we destroy it completely. This argument grounds ethics in a specific way, but it remains at the level of general principle. It tells you that human responsibility matters, but does not yet specify what concrete obligations follow. And it faces an immediate practical problem. Personal ethical commitment is one thing, but the threats Sagan is most concerned about operate at the level of entire civilizations. Nuclear weapons, environmental collapse, the slow erosion of the capacity to think clearly. These are not problems that individual virtue can solve. They require collective action on a scale that matches the scale of the threat. And for that, you need to ask what happens when Sagan's cosmological ethics meets the concrete possibility of species-level self-destruction. Part 9. Nuclear Winter and the Ethics of Extinction. In the early 1980s, Sagan was at the peak of his fame as the host of Cosmos. He could have spent the rest of his career giving elegant lectures about the beauty of the universe. Instead, he made a choice that puzzled and angered many of his colleagues. He turned the full weight of his scientific reputation and public platform toward a single political issue: the nuclear arms race. This was not a sentimental decision. It was the direct application of the philosophical framework he had been building for decades. If the pale blue dot argument is correct, if this planet is the only known home for conscious life and no rescue is coming from elsewhere, then the deliberate or accidental destruction of that life is the gravest moral failure imaginable. Not just terrible, but categorically worse than any other ethical violation, because it would be irreversible in a way that nothing else is. A war can end, and a civilization can rebuild. An extinction of conscious life, if it is truly unique in this region of the cosmos, cannot be undone. What Sagan brought to this question was not just moral outrage, but a specific scientific contribution. Along with 4 colleagues, he co-authored a study that became known by the initials of its authors, the TTAPS paper, published in 1983. The study used atmospheric modelling to investigate what would happen to the Earth's climate after a large-scale nuclear exchange. The answer, which Sagan published first in a widely read magazine article, was devastating. A nuclear war involving thousands of warheads would ignite firestorms across large areas of multiple continents. Those firestorms would inject massive quantities of soot and smoke into the upper atmosphere. Once in the stratosphere, the soot would block sunlight for weeks or months. Surface temperatures would plummet, potentially by dozens of degrees. Growing seasons would be disrupted or eliminated across the planet, including in countries far from any nuclear detonation. agriculture would collapse globally, not just in the countries that launched the weapons. The result would be famine and civilizational breakdown on a scale that could threaten the survival of the human species. Sagan and his colleague Richard Turco called this scenario nuclear winter. The philosophical significance of nuclear winter extends far beyond the policy debate it triggered. Before this research, the standard framing of nuclear war treated it as a bilateral catastrophe. Two nations fire at each other, both are devastated, and the rest of the world suffers secondary consequences. The nuclear winter hypothesis shattered that framing. It revealed that a war between two countries could destroy agricultural systems everywhere on Earth. Nations that never fired a weapon and never were targeted could lose their capacity to feed their populations. The consequences of nuclear war were not confined to the combatants. They were species-level. This finding connected directly to Sagan's cosmological ethics. If we are custodians of the only known consciousness in the universe, and if a nuclear exchange could end that consciousness or reduce it to pre-industrial survival, then the arsenals held by a few nations are not merely a danger to those nations. They are a danger to the entire project of life, knowing itself. The moral calculus changes completely once you recognize that the risk is not just national, but existential. Sagan was honest about the limitations of the TTAPS model. The initial study used a relatively simple atmospheric simulation that treated the Earth as a single vertical column. It did not account for the moderating effects of oceans or the complexities of three-dimensional atmospheric circulation. Critics, some of them politically motivated and some of them scientifically serious, pointed this out. Later studies using more advanced models revised some of the numbers downward. The extreme cooling scenarios in the original paper may have overstated the effects. But the core conclusion survived subsequent research, that a large-scale nuclear war would produce significant prolonged global cooling with catastrophic effects on agriculture and human survival. The debate shifted from whether nuclear winter would occur to how severe it would be. Sagan also faced a harder criticism, one that went beyond scientific methodology to the relationship between science and politics. Some scientists argued that he had crossed a line by publicizing preliminary results in a mass circulation magazine before the work had been fully vetted. They accused him of leveraging his celebrity to create public pressure around findings that were not yet scientifically mature. This charge had substance. Sagan acknowledged that the science needed refinement and called for better models himself. But he also argued that when the stakes are species survival, waiting for perfect data is its own form of recklessness. The cost of raising the alarm too early might be embarrassment. The cost of raising it too late might be extinction. This tension between scientific caution and the urgency of existential risk is one that Sagan never fully resolved. His epistemology, as laid out in the Baloney detection kit, demands rigour, patience and falsifiability. His ethics, as laid out in the pale blue dot argument, demands action proportional to the stakes, even when the evidence is incomplete. When the stakes are high enough, these two principles can pull in opposite directions. How much certainty do you need before sounding an alarm that could save or fail to save the species? Sagan lived inside this contradiction for the rest of his career, and it is one of the most instructive tensions in his entire body of work. But the nuclear winter argument, whatever its scientific limitations, accomplished something profound in Sagan's philosophical framework. It demonstrated that species-level ethics is not an abstraction. It is a concrete problem with measurable parameters, identifiable risks, and available solutions. Sagan argued that the weapons already existed in sufficient quantity to trigger the scenario, and that the only reliable prevention was drastic reduction in the number of warheads, far below what either superpower considered acceptable at the time. Personal virtue could not solve this problem. Individual nations acting in self-interest could not solve it either, because nuclear winter is a global consequence of bilateral action. Only collective, international, evidence-based decision-making had any chance of working. And that raises a question that Sagan had been circling for years. What kind of political system is capable of making rational decisions in the face of existential stakes? What institutions can protect the capacity for clear thinking when the pressures to abandon it are overwhelming? Part 10. Science and Democracy as the same idea. Most people think of science and democracy as belonging to entirely different categories. Science is about nature, about atoms and cells and galaxies. Democracy is about politics, about votes and laws and rights. One happens in laboratories, the other in legislatures. Sagan argues that this separation is an illusion. Not a metaphorical connection, but a structural identity. Science and democracy, he claims, run on the same underlying logic. They share the same core values, and they emerge together for a reason. The shared logic is this: both are systems designed to function despite the unreliability of any individual participant. Democracy does not assume that voters are wise. It assumes that no single ruler or faction can be trusted with unchecked power, and it builds corrective mechanisms into the structure of governance itself. Separation of powers means that one branch can check the errors of another. Free speech means that bad policies can be publicly challenged before they become permanent. Regular elections mean that leaders who fail can be replaced without violence. The entire architecture is designed around the expectation that people in power will make mistakes and sometimes act in bad faith. The system does not prevent error. It creates channels for correcting error before it becomes catastrophic. Science, as Sagan has already established, works the same way. It does not assume that any individual scientist is objective or free from bias. It assumes the opposite, and it builds correction into the institution. Peer review is the scientific equivalent of an independent judiciary. Replication is the scientific equivalent of a free press. The demand for falsifiability is the scientific equivalent of the right to challenge authority. In both systems, the power to overturn established conclusions is distributed, not concentrated, and in both systems, the health of the institution depends on protecting the right to dissent. Sagan points out that this parallel is not a coincidence. Both science and democracy, in their recognizably modern forms, trace their origins to the same time and place. Ancient Greece in the 6th and 7th centuries before the Common Era saw the first systematic attempts both to govern by collective deliberation and to explain the natural world through evidence rather than myth. The Athenian assembly and the Ionian natural philosophers were products of the same cultural shift, a move away from the authority of kings and priests toward the authority of argument and evidence. The practical consequence of this structural identity is Sagan's sharpest political claim. A society that cannot do science cannot sustain democracy, and a society that suppresses democracy will eventually cripple its science. The two are not merely compatible, they are mutually dependent. When a government declares certain questions too dangerous to ask, it has broken the mechanism that science requires. When a population cannot evaluate evidence, it has lost the capacity that democratic self-governance requires. Sagan identifies specific mechanisms by which this breakdown occurs, and he identifies them decades before the language of post-truth enters the public vocabulary. The first is the defunding and degradation of public education, particularly in science and mathematics. When citizens do not understand how evidence works, they cannot tell the difference between a tested conclusion and a confident assertion. They become, in his words, unable to distinguish those who only pretend to knowledge from those who actually possess it. The second mechanism is the concentration of media in fewer hands, leading to a collapse of substantive content in favour of spectacle. Sound bites replace analysis, and the audience is trained to respond to emotional triggers rather than to evaluate arguments. The third mechanism is the deliberate cultivation of cynicism. The idea that all claims are equally suspect, all experts equally biased, and all truth equally uncertain. This is not healthy skepticism. This is the weaponization of doubt to paralyze the capacity for judgment. In 1995, Sagan wrote a passage about an America in which the public has lost the ability to distinguish real from false, where substantive content has decayed, where pseudoscience fills the void left by vanishing scientific literacy, and where a kind of celebration of ignorance takes hold. He described it as a foreboding for his children's or grandchildren's generation. The passage has been widely shared in the years since, because its accuracy is difficult to contest. But the point is not that Sagan was prophetic in any mysterious sense. He was applying the same analytical method he used everywhere else. If you understand the structural relationship between scientific thinking and democratic governance, and you observe that the foundations of scientific thinking are being eroded, the political consequences follow as a prediction, not as speculation. In his final interview, given to a television journalist months before his death in 1996, Sagan compressed this argument into its starkest form. "We have built a civilization that depends entirely on science and technology," he said. "Almost nobody in that civilization understands science and technology. This is a volatile combination of ignorance and power that will, sooner or later, produce disaster. And if we cannot ask skeptical questions of those in authority, if we cannot interrogate claims and demand evidence, then we are vulnerable to every charlatan, political or religious, who happens to appear." This is a powerful framework, but it contains an unresolved tension. Even functioning democracies operate on short timescales. Election cycles last a few years. Quarterly earnings reports measure corporate performance in months. The human lifespan rarely exceeds a century. But the threats Sagan is most concerned about, nuclear annihilation, environmental collapse, the slow erosion of civilizational capacity, operate across decades, centuries, and millennia. How do you build political institutions that can reason on timescales vastly longer than any voter's life? How do you create responsibility for consequences that no living person will ever witness? Part 11. The duty to educate. The tension between democratic short-termism and existential long-term threats leads Sagan to a conclusion that he holds with absolute conviction. Science education is not a luxury. It is not a nice addition to an already complete curriculum. It is a survival requirement for any civilization that depends on technology and aspires to self-governance. This claim sounds like a platitude until you examine Sagan's specific critique of how science is actually taught. The problem, he argues, is not that schools fail to teach enough science. The problem is that they teach science in a way that systematically destroys the very capacities it should develop. Consider how a typical student encounters science in school. She is presented with a set of conclusions. The Earth orbits the Sun, DNA encodes genetic information, matter is made of atoms. She memorizes these conclusions, writes them on an exam, and receives a grade. At no point in this process does she experience the reasoning that produced these conclusions. She does not learn why the heliocentric model replaced the geocentric one, what evidence forced the change, or what it felt like to hold the old view and realize it could not account for the data. She learns the answers of science without learning the method of science. And the method is the entire point. A student who memorizes that the Earth orbits the Sun has gained a fact. A student who understands why we believe the Earth orbits the Sun, what observations support it, what observations would contradict it, and how the conclusion was tested against alternatives, has gained something far more valuable. She has gained the capacity to evaluate any claim in any domain by the same set of criteria. The fact is local, the method is universal. Sagan notes that every child begins as a natural scientist. Young children ask relentless fundamental questions. Why is the sky blue? Where does the wind come from? What are stars? These questions are genuine acts of inquiry. The child does not know the answer and is not pretending to wonder for the sake of politeness. She actually wants to know, and she is prepared to be surprised by the answer. This is the raw material of scientific thinking, curiosity combined with a tolerance for unexpected results, and in most educational systems it is methodically extinguished. The extinguishing happens not through malice, but through structure. Questions are replaced by answers. Exploration is replaced by memorization. The authority of the textbook replaces the authority of evidence. A student who asks, "But how do we know that?" is treated as disruptive rather than scientifically minded. By the time she reaches adulthood, she has learned that science is a collection of facts delivered by authorities, not a method of inquiry she can practice herself. And a person who thinks of science as a collection of authoritative facts is indistinguishable in her reasoning habits from a person who accepts any other kind of authoritative claim without question. This is why Sagan calls the failure of science education a political danger, not merely an intellectual one. A population that has never learned to evaluate evidence is a population that can be led by anyone who speaks with sufficient confidence. The content of the confident speech does not matter. It could be a demagogue, a cult leader, a conspiracy theorist, or a corporation selling a product. What matters is that the audience has been trained to receive conclusions rather than to interrogate them. The skill of interrogation was available to them as children, and the educational system replaced it with compliance. Sagan's prescription is not simply more funding for science classes, though he supports that. His prescription is a fundamental change in what science education means. The goal should not be to produce people who know the right answers. The goal should be to produce people who know how to evaluate whether any answer is right. This means teaching the method, how to form hypotheses, how to test them, how to recognize when your evidence is insufficient, how to change your mind when the data requires it. These are not esoteric skills reserved for professional scientists. They are the basic cognitive equipment that every citizen needs to navigate a world saturated with competing claims. But Sagan's own career reveals a tension within this prescription. He is an advocate for reason, evidence, and skeptical inquiry. Yet he also knows, from decades of experience communicating with the public, that reason alone does not move people. What moves people is narrative, beauty, emotional resonance, and the feeling of encountering something larger than themselves. The most logically rigorous argument in the world will fail if it cannot compete for attention with a vivid story told with conviction. Sagan does not merely acknowledge this. He builds his entire public career around it. And that raises a question about the relationship between his rationalist philosophy and his storytelling method. Is there a contradiction between the two, or is the storytelling itself an extension of the rationalism? Part 12. The Storyteller's Method. When Cosmos aired on public television in 1980, roughly 500 million people across 60 countries watched it. No science program had ever reached an audience of that scale. The companion book became the best-selling science book of its era. Sagan became the most recognizable scientist on the planet, more famous than most of the researchers whose work he was explaining. The standard interpretation is that Sagan was simply a gifted communicator, a scientist with the talent for making difficult ideas accessible. This misses what he was actually doing. Sagan was not dumbing science down. He was reconstructing it from the ground up, using the tools of narrative, image, and emotional resonance, because he believed these tools were not opposed to reason, but essential to its transmission. His reasoning went like this. The human brain did not evolve to process abstract propositions. It evolved to process stories, sequences of causally connected events involving characters with motives operating in specific environments. A piece of information embedded in a story is retained and felt in ways that the same information delivered as a bare fact is not. This is not a weakness to be overcome. It is a feature of human cognition that any effective communicator must work with rather than against. Sagan applies this insight systematically in Cosmos. He does not begin an explanation with a principle and then illustrate it with an example. He begins with a person, a place, a moment of discovery, and lets the principle emerge from the story. The history of astronomy is told through the lives of the people who did the observing. Eratosthenes measures the circumference of the Earth using the shadow of a stick in 2 different cities. Kepler struggles for years to reconcile Tycho Brahe's observational data with his own aesthetic preference for circular orbits, and fails and has to accept that the orbits are elliptical. Each story does philosophical work. Eratosthenes demonstrates that simple observations, combined with geometry, can reveal facts about objects too large to see directly. Kepler demonstrates that loyalty to evidence must override loyalty to your own expectations. The stories are not decorations on top of the science. They are the science, presented in the form that the human brain is best equipped to receive. Sagan also uses scale and visual spectacle as philosophical instruments. The spaceship of the imagination, the recurring visual device in Cosmos, is not mere entertainment. By placing the viewer at different positions in the universe, looking in from vast distances or zooming down to molecular scales, Sagan forces a constant renegotiation of the viewer's sense of proportion. Every shift in scale is an argument against complacency. You thought you knew how big the world was, and you were wrong by many orders of magnitude. You thought human history was long, and it occupies the final seconds of the cosmic calendar. The visual experience of these shifts does something that a verbal description cannot. It bypasses the conceptual defenses that allow you to hear the numbers without feeling them. Sagan makes one further claim about his method, and it is the one that matters most to his overall philosophy. He argues that the universe as revealed by science is genuinely more dramatic than any myth. Not more comforting, not more flattering, but more structurally complex, more surprising, more worthy of awe. The birth and death of stars, the accidental emergence of life from chemistry, the 4-billion-year chain of replication and variation that connects you to the first self-copying molecule, the sheer improbability that matter organized itself into a form capable of wondering about its own origins. These are not dry facts waiting to be dressed up in narrative clothing. They are inherently dramatic, and the only reason they do not compete with religious and mythological stories for public attention is that they are rarely told with equivalent skill. This is why Sagan does not see his public communication as separate from his philosophy. If science produces genuine wonder, as he argued in Part 5, and if that wonder can only reach most people through narrative and emotional engagement, then the act of telling the scientific story well is itself a philosophical project. It is the delivery mechanism for the naturalistic worldview he has been building. Without it, his ideas about wonder, ethics and responsibility remain confined to books that only a small audience will read. With it, they enter the culture at scale. But this method has costs, and Sagan's critics within the scientific community identified them early and pressed them hard. Is something lost when complex ideas are translated for a general audience? Does the celebrity of the communicator distort the science being communicated? And is there a real tension between the rigor Sagan demands in his Epistemology and the emotional persuasion he deploys in his storytelling? Part 13. The Critique from the Academy. The most visible consequence of Sagan's public fame was institutional. In 1991, he was nominated for membership in the National Academy of Sciences, one of the highest honors available to an American scientist. Despite the support of prominent colleagues, including Nobel laureates who advocated for his admission, the nomination failed. He did not receive the required two-thirds vote and was rejected. Sagan's biographers have argued that this rejection was a direct manifestation of what has since become known as the Sagan effect. The term refers to a widely held assumption within academic science that a scientist who becomes publicly visible must be less serious as a researcher. The reasoning is roughly this: real science requires total dedication. Time spent on television or writing popular books is time not spent at the bench or the telescope. Therefore, a scientist who is famous with the public is probably not producing work that impresses his peers. This critique had a surface plausibility in Sagan's case. He was extraordinarily visible, regularly appearing on late-night television, writing for mass circulation magazines, and hosting a program seen by hundreds of millions of people. It would be reasonable to wonder whether anyone could maintain serious research output while sustaining that level of public engagement. But the evidence did not support the assumption. Across his career, Sagan authored or co-authored more than 600 peer-reviewed scientific papers. He made substantive contributions to planetary science, including early work on the greenhouse effect on Venus and research on the atmospheres of other planets. His publication rate was comparable to, and in some cases exceeded, that of National Academy members who never engaged with the public at all. The perception that his popularization came at the expense of his science was, in measurable terms, false. The deeper issue the Sagan effect reveals is a structural bias within academic science that cuts against Sagan's own philosophical commitments. If science requires democratic participation to function, as Sagan argues, then scientists must communicate with the public. But if the institutions that evaluate scientific careers punish public communication, then the system actively discourages the very behavior it needs to survive. Harvard had earlier denied Sagan tenure, and while the reasons were complex, the suspicion among his supporters was that his public profile played a role. The message received by younger scientists was clear: engaging the public is a career risk. Subsequent research on the Sagan effect has complicated the picture. Studies examining the publication records of scientists who engage in public outreach have found that most suffer no measurable career penalty, and some actually outperform their less visible peers. But the perception of a penalty persists, and perception drives behavior. Scientists have reported losing grants, being reprimanded by supervisors, and facing informal sanctions for activities as modest as giving a public talk or writing for a non-specialist audience. The culture of academic science, at least in some fields, treats visibility as a form of frivolity. Beyond the institutional critique, there are philosophical objections to Sagan's approach that deserve full-strength presentation. The first is the charge of oversimplification. When you translate a complex scientific finding into language a general audience can understand, something is necessarily lost. The caveats, the error bars, the unresolved questions, the competing interpretations, all of these tend to be smoothed away in the translation. What the public receives is a cleaner, more confident version of the science than what actually exists. and a public that has been given an oversimplified version of science may be unprepared when that science is later revised or overturned. They may feel betrayed, not understanding that revision is how science is supposed to work. The second philosophical objection cuts deeper. Several philosophers and theologians have argued that Sagan's naturalism smuggles in values it cannot justify on its own terms. When Sagan says we should feel awe at the universe, or that we have a responsibility to protect conscious life, he is making normative claims about what ought to be the case. Science as a method tells you what is the case. It can tell you what the universe looks like, how it works, and what will happen if you do certain things. But it cannot tell you that you should care, or that destruction is wrong, or that wonder is an appropriate response to complexity. These are value judgments, and the charge is that Sagan imports them from outside his scientific framework while presenting them as if they follow naturally from it. This is a version of what philosophers call the is-ought problem, first articulated by David Hume in the 18th century. You cannot derive what you should do from a description of what is the case, no matter how complete that description is. Sagan's response, implicit rather than fully worked out, is that certain values become so strongly suggested by the facts that declining to adopt them requires a kind of willful blindness. If you truly understand that this planet is the only known home of consciousness, the conclusion that you should protect it feels less like a leap and more like a recognition. But critics rightly point out that feels like a recognition is not the same as a logical derivation. The gap between is and ought remains, however narrow Sagan makes it appear. These are serious objections, and they point to genuine limitations in Sagan's philosophy. But the deepest challenge to his project is not about logic or career incentives. It is about whether his faith in human reason, his conviction that people will choose truth over comfort if given the proper tools, is itself a form of optimism that the evidence does not fully support. That question requires a full reckoning, but before we reach it, there's one more domain where Sagan's philosophy operates as active science: the search for other minds. Part 14. The Search for Other Minds. Sagan's commitment to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence was not a side interest or a hobbyist enthusiasm. It was the direct extension of his core philosophical commitments into scientific practice. If his entire ethics rests on the premise that conscious life may be rare or unique, then testing that premise is not optional. It is the most important empirical question his framework faces. The scientific approach to this question took shape in 1961, when astronomer Frank Drake convened a small gathering of scientists at an observatory in West Virginia. Sagan, then 27 years old, was among the attendees. Drake proposed a mathematical framework for organizing what was then a wildly speculative question into a series of distinct, potentially answerable sub-questions. The framework breaks the problem into factors. How many stars form per year? How many have planets? How many of those planets could support life? How many actually develop life? How many develop intelligence? How many develop technology capable of interstellar communication? And how long such civilizations survive? The power of this framework is not that it gives you an answer. Most of the factors were unknown in 1961, and several remain poorly constrained even now. The power is that it transforms a single unanswerable question into a sequence of questions, each of which can be investigated independently. You do not need to solve the whole problem at once. You can make progress on the astronomical factors while biologists work on the life-related ones and sociologists debate the longevity factor. Sagan identified a specific philosophical insight embedded in this framework. He argued that the most uncertain factor, the one that dominates all the others, is the last one. How long technological civilizations survive. All the preceding factors could be relatively favorable. Stars could routinely produce habitable planets, life could emerge readily, intelligence could evolve frequently. But if every civilization destroys itself shortly after developing technology capable of interstellar communication, the galaxy would be vast and full of potential, but effectively silent. The number of civilizations detectable at any given moment depends critically on how long each one lasts. This is where the search for extraterrestrial intelligence connects directly to Sagan's ethics. If the silence of the cosmos is evidence that civilizations routinely destroy themselves, then our own survival is not guaranteed by the mere fact of our existence. We are running the same experiment that may have failed elsewhere many times over. The nuclear arsenals, the environmental destruction, the erosion of rational governance, these are not merely our local problems. They may be the standard failure mode for any species that reaches our level of technological power before reaching a corresponding level of wisdom. Sagan was honest about the profound uncertainty here. We have exactly one example of a planet that produced intelligence, and it is the planet we are standing on. We have no way to estimate most of the relevant probabilities from a sample of one. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence is an attempt to expand that sample, even by a single additional data point, because the implications of any detection would be enormous. If we detect another intelligence, several of Sagan's claims would need to be revised. The argument that conscious life is rare or unique, which underpins his ethics of existential caution, would be weakened. But a different argument would be strengthened. If the detected civilization has survived for a long time, that would be evidence that the self-destruction problem is not inevitably fatal. It would mean that at least one species found a way through the bottleneck. And that would be, in Sagan's framework, possibly the most important piece of information our species could ever receive. If we never detect another intelligence, the silence carries its own weight. Either intelligence is extraordinarily rare, which amplifies the ethical urgency of protecting the one example we know of, or intelligence is common but short-lived, which is a much darker conclusion and an even stronger argument for the changes Sagan spent his career advocating. Either way, the silence speaks. There is an assumption buried deep in this entire project, however, that deserves examination. The search assumes that intelligence, wherever it arises, will be recognizable. That it will use technology we can detect, communicate in patterns we can decode, and operate on scales we can observe. But even on Earth, we struggle to understand minds very different from our own. We share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees and still cannot fully grasp their inner experience. We have lived alongside whales and octopuses for our entire history and remain uncertain about the nature of their cognition. The assumption that we could recognize and comprehend a mind that evolved under completely different physical conditions, on a different planet, with a different chemistry, is an extraordinary assumption, and it may reveal a limit of Sagan's universalism, a residual anthropocentrism in a thinker who spent his career trying to overcome exactly that. Part 15. Extraordinary claims. The phrase "extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence" is probably the single sentence most associated with Sagan's name. Most people treat it as a slogan, a memorable way of saying "be skeptical." But it functions in Sagan's thought as a serious epistemological principle, and when you examine it closely, it reveals both considerable power and some instructive blind spots. The principle rests on a straightforward idea about probability. Not all claims start on equal footing. A claim that is consistent with everything else you know about the world requires only ordinary evidence to be accepted. Your neighbour tells you she drove to the store this morning. You know she has a car, you know stores exist, you know people drive to them. Ordinary testimony is sufficient because nothing in the claim contradicts your existing understanding. Now, suppose your neighbour tells you she was abducted by aliens this morning. This claim, if true, would require overturning a vast amount of established knowledge. It would require that extraterrestrial beings have reached Earth, that they have abduction technology, that they returned her safely, and that no physical evidence was left behind. Each of these sub-claims is extraordinary on its own. The combined claim requires correspondingly powerful evidence, not because it is impossible, but because accepting it means revising an enormous body of well-established understanding. The principle works well as a filter against everyday credulity. It explains why a single eyewitness account should not override decades of controlled experiments. It explains why a blurry photograph does not constitute evidence for something that physics says should not exist. It explains why personal conviction, no matter how sincere, is not evidence for anything beyond the fact that someone is convinced. But the principle has edges that cut in directions Sagan himself had to navigate carefully. The question, what counts as extraordinary, is not always easy to answer. And the question, who decides, is even harder. What seems extraordinary depends on your existing framework of beliefs, and frameworks can be wrong. Consider the history of science itself. Continental drift was considered an extraordinary, almost laughable claim when Alfred Wegener proposed it in 1912. The idea that continents move across the surface of the Earth contradicted everything geologists thought they knew about the solidity and permanence of the ground beneath their feet. The evidence Wegener presented, the matching coastlines of Africa and South America, shared fossil species on separated continents, was dismissed as insufficient, precisely because the claim was deemed too extraordinary. It took decades and the discovery of plate tectonics to vindicate him. During those decades, the demand for extraordinary evidence functioned not as a tool of good science, but as a barrier to it. Bacterial ulcers provide another case. For most of the 20th century, medical science held that stomach ulcers were caused by stress and diet. When Barry Marshall and Robin Warren proposed in the 1980s that ulcers were caused by a bacterial infection, the claim was extraordinary by the standards of the existing framework. bacteria were not supposed to be able to survive in the acid environment of the stomach. Marshall famously infected himself with the bacterium to demonstrate the connection. Even then, acceptance was slow because the claim violated deep assumptions about what was biologically possible. These examples do not refute Sagan's principle. They refine it. The principle is at its most powerful when applied symmetrically, not just to new claims that challenge your framework, but to the framework itself. A good scientist must be willing to ask whether the existing consensus has earned its status through evidence or merely through inertia. The demand for extraordinary evidence can protect you from accepting false claims, but it can also protect you from accepting true ones if you are not equally rigorous about questioning your own prior beliefs. Sagan's own career illustrates this tension. He was willing to pursue ideas before the evidence was conclusive, as the nuclear winter research showed. He championed the search for extraterrestrial intelligence at a time when many colleagues considered it barely scientific. He advocated for the investigation of phenomena that the scientific establishment largely ignored, like the potential for life on other planets in our solar system. In each of these cases, he was making claims that his own principle would flag as requiring extraordinary evidence. He navigated this by insisting on the distinction between pursuing a hypothesis and accepting it. The pursuit is scientifically legitimate as long as you are willing to abandon the hypothesis if the evidence goes against you. The error lies not in asking extraordinary questions, but in accepting extraordinary answers without extraordinary support. Part 16. The Humility of Not Knowing. There is a moment that occurs in almost every conversation about a difficult question, a moment when someone says, "I don't know," and the room shifts. In most social contexts, not knowing is treated as a failure. It suggests ignorance, unpreparedness, weakness. An expert who admits uncertainty on a talk show loses credibility in real time. A politician who says, "I'm not sure," is devoured by opponents who are confident, even when the confidence is unearned. The culture rewards certainty and punishes the admission of its absence. Sagan treats this cultural pattern as one of the most dangerous features of human social life. Not because uncertainty is comfortable, but because honesty about the limits of your knowledge is the only posture from which new knowledge can be acquired. If you are certain, you have stopped looking. If you have stopped looking, you are no longer doing science, no matter how many degrees hang on your wall. He makes a specific distinction between two very different psychological states that are often confused. The first is ignorance combined with anxiety. You do not know, and the not knowing frightens you, so you grab the nearest available answer and hold on. This is the state that drives people towards pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, and dogmatic belief systems. It is not a love of falsehood, but a terror of the open question. The second state is ignorance combined with curiosity. You do not know, and the not knowing is itself a source of engagement. The open question is not a void to be filled as quickly as possible. It is a live problem to be worked on, a direction of investigation, a call to look more carefully. This second state is what Sagan calls the marriage of skepticism and wonder, and it is the emotional foundation of his entire intellectual project. He argues that the capacity to remain in this second state, To hold an open question without collapsing into premature certainty requires a specific kind of courage. It requires resisting the social pressure to have an opinion on everything. It requires accepting that some questions may not be answered in your lifetime. It requires being publicly comfortable with the sentence, "We do not yet know," at a time when that sentence is treated as a confession of failure rather than an honest report from the frontier. This connects directly back to his account of wonder. If wonder, as Sagan argued, is the encounter with complexity that exceeds your capacity to fully comprehend, then the open question is not the enemy of wonder, but its precondition. A universe in which everything is already known is a universe from which wonder has been exhausted. The feeling of awe depends on the existence of things you have not yet understood. To close down all open questions is to close down the source of awe itself. Sagan also argues that this intellectual humility has ethical consequences. A person who is honest about the limits of her knowledge is far less dangerous than a person who is not. The greatest atrocities in human history have been committed by people who were certain they were right. Certain about the inferiority of another race, certain about the will of God, certain about the direction of history, certain about the enemy within. Uncertainty, genuinely felt and honestly expressed, is a brake on the kind of catastrophic action that certainty enables. It does not produce paralysis. It produces caution proportional to the stakes. But there is a final question that Sagan's intellectual humility opens without fully answering. His comfort with uncertainty, his trust that open questions can be lived with rather than fled from, depends on a deeper assumption that he rarely makes explicit. The assumption is that the universe is intelligible, that the open questions are, in principle, answerable. That patient investigation will eventually yield understanding, even if not in his lifetime or ours. This is a powerful and productive assumption. It has underwritten 4 centuries of scientific progress. But it is itself unprovable. It is a form of trust, a bet placed on the structure of reality, that the universe will continue to make sense when interrogated carefully. Whether that trust is justified or whether it is itself a kind of faith is a question Sagan leaves to those who come after him. Part 17. Where Sagan breaks and where he holds. Every honest assessment of a philosophical system must identify the points where it cracks under pressure. Sagan's is no exception. He built something remarkable, a coherent naturalistic philosophy that starts from epistemology, moves through psychology and ethics, and arrives at a concrete vision of political and civilizational responsibility. But it rests on assumptions that can be challenged, and some of those challenges have only sharpened in the decades since his death. The first crack is in his model of human rationality. Sagan treats irrationality as a problem with a solution: better education, better critical thinking tools, better institutional design. The implication is that if you give people the right methods, they will generally use them, because truth is ultimately more satisfying than falsehood once you learn how to find it. This is an optimistic view of human nature, and research in cognitive science and social psychology has complicated it considerably. The work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, roughly contemporary with Sagan's career, demonstrated that cognitive biases are not occasional malfunctions, but permanent features of human information processing. They cannot be eliminated through education. They can be partially mitigated in specific contexts with considerable effort, but they never go away. More troublingly, research on motivated reasoning has shown that intelligence and education can actually make certain biases worse, not better. A highly educated person is not less likely to engage in motivated reasoning than an uneducated one. She is merely better at constructing sophisticated justifications for conclusions she has already reached on emotional grounds. This finding does not destroy Sagan's epistemology, but it weakens the link between his epistemology and his politics. If the Baloney detection kit works as a method, but most people will not consistently use it, regardless of how well they are taught, then education is a necessary but insufficient remedy. The political project of creating a scientifically literate citizenry may be harder, perhaps fundamentally harder, than Sagan believed. The second crack is in his account of wonder as a replacement for religious experience. Sagan's naturalistic wonder is real and powerful. Many people have felt it, but whether it serves the same psychological functions as religious belief is a genuinely open question. Religion provides not only wonder, but also community, ritual, moral structure, a narrative of personal significance, consolation in grief, and the promise of ultimate justice. Sagan's naturalism offers wonder and moral urgency, but does not provide ritual, community, or consolation in any structured form. A person who leaves religion for Sagan's worldview may gain intellectual honesty, but lose the social architecture that held her life together. Whether that trade is worth making depends on factors Sagan does not fully address. The third crack is in his politics of existential risk. Sagan assumes that if people understand the stakes, they will act rationally to reduce them. The decades since his death have tested this assumption with climate change, a threat he identified early and clearly. The evidence for climate change is overwhelming. The scientific consensus is as close to unanimous as any consensus in science gets. The consequences of inaction are well documented and increasingly visible. And yet the political response has been, by any measure, radically insufficient relative to the scale of the problem. The failure is not primarily one of understanding. Most people in developed nations know at some level that climate change is real and dangerous. The failure is one of action in the face of understanding, which is precisely the gap that Sagan's framework struggles to bridge. The fourth crack may be the deepest. Sagan's entire ethical system depends on the claim that we are, or may be, alone. That conscious life is rare or unique enough to warrant the extraordinary protections he argues for. But we have no evidence for this claim in either direction. It is an assumption, and it is exactly the kind of untestable assumption that Sagan's own epistemology should flag as insufficiently grounded. He is aware of this, which is why the search for extraterrestrial intelligence occupies such a central place in his thought. But until that search produces a result, his ethics rests on a foundation he himself would describe as provisional. These are real cracks. They should not be minimized or explained away. But here is what holds. The core of Sagan's philosophy is not a set of conclusions about wonder or politics or extraterrestrial life. The core is a commitment to a method, the disciplined, self-correcting, evidence-based interrogation of reality combined with the emotional honesty to accept what you find. This commitment does not depend on optimism about human rationality. It does not depend on naturalistic wonder being a perfect substitute for religion. It does not depend on education being sufficient to solve every problem. It depends only on the claim that there is no better alternative. And on this point, Sagan has not been refuted. No one has identified a more reliable method for distinguishing true claims from false ones. No one has proposed a system of governance more resistant to catastrophic error than one built on the right to challenge authority with evidence. No one has found a way to navigate existential risks that does not ultimately depend on accurate information about the physical world. The tools Sagan identified may be harder to deploy than he hoped. They may require institutional structures he did not fully envision. They may need to be supplemented with insights from psychology, sociology, and political science that go beyond what he offered. But they remain the foundation. In his final years, Sagan knew he was dying. He had been diagnosed with a bone marrow disease and had undergone multiple transplants. In his last interview, he did not soften his message or retreat into personal reflection. He talked about the same things he had always talked about: the danger of ignorance, the necessity of skepticism, the obligation to educate, and the extraordinary fragility of the only civilization we have. He maintained to the end that the habits of honest inquiry are the single most important thing a species can possess. Not because those habits guarantee survival, but because without them, every other effort at survival is guesswork. Whether his optimism was justified is a question that history is still answering. But the framework he built for asking the question remains the best one available.